Chapter 1. Stop reacting. That's the disease. Let's be direct. Your biggest problem is not your past. It's not your circumstances. It's not other people. Your biggest problem is reaction. You react to tone. You react to pressure. You react to disrespect, delays, silence, criticism, and uncertainty. And every time you react, you give something outside of you control. That's the disease. Reaction is automatic. Reaction is emotional. Reaction feels justified. And that's why it destroys you. You don't notice it because it feels normal. You don't question it because everyone else does it too. But hear this clearly. If it can trigger you, it controls you. That's the key. Most people live their entire lives being pushed around by invisible buttons. A comment ruins their mood. A delay ruins their day. A look, a tone, a message left on read. Suddenly their focus is gone. They call it stress. They call it being human. They call it personality. No, it's lack of control. And you have a choice. You always have a choice. The problem is you've never been taught that reaction is optional. From childhood, you were conditioned to respond. Answer quickly. Defend yourself. Explain yourself. Justify yourself. You were trained to react before you were trained to think. So now, reaction feels natural. But natural does not mean effective. A reactive person is predictable. A predictable person is easy to manipulate. And an easily manipulated person will never control their life. Look at your own patterns. When someone challenges you, what happens? Your body tightens. Your mind speeds up. You start talking before thinking. That's reaction. When something doesn't go your way, what happens? You complain. You spiral. You lose energy. That's reaction. When pressure hits, when expectations rise, when uncertainty shows up, do you slow down or speed up? Most people speed up. They rush decisions. They send messages they regret. They say yes when they should say nothing. Reaction creates chaos. Reaction creates mistakes. Reaction creates regret. And here's the brutal truth. Reaction feels powerful in the moment, but it costs you later. That's the trade most people never see. They feel relief when they vent. They feel justified when they argue. They feel strong when they snap back. But later, they lose leverage. They lose respect. They lose options. Because emotional reactions don't solve problems. They expose weakness. You don't need their permission to pause. You don't need their permission to think. You don't need their permission to stay calm. You have a choice. Always. Control does not start with action. It starts with restraint. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest. It's not the angriest. It's not the fastest to respond. It's the one who doesn't react. Because while everyone else is burning energy, they're gathering information. That's the key. When you react, you stop observing. When you stop observing, you start guessing. And when you guess, you lose. This is why reaction is the disease. It shuts down intelligence. It hijacks strategy. It turns small problems into permanent damage. Think about conflict. Most conflicts don't escalate because of the issue. They escalate because of reaction. A tone is misinterpreted. A comment is taken personally. An assumption is made without evidence. Reaction piles on reaction. And suddenly, what could have been nothing becomes everything. Now here's where most people get stuck. They say, but that's just how I feel. No. Feelings are signals, not commands. You are not required to obey every emotion that passes through you. You have a choice. It's not about suppressing emotion. It's about not letting emotion drive the vehicle. That's the distinction. You don't kill the feeling. You delay the response. That pause, that gap, that moment of restraint. That's where control lives. And most people never use it. Instead, they justify reaction with stories. He disrespected me. She shouldn't have said that. They pushed my buttons. Listen carefully. No one can push a button you didn't install. That's the key. Triggers don't come from the outside. They come from unresolved expectations on the inside. When you react, you're revealing where you're still attached, where you still need approval, where you still need validation. That's not an insult. That's information. And information is power, if you use it. So here's the first discipline. When something triggers you, do not act. Observe. Ask yourself one question. What expectation of mine just got violated? That's it. Not who's wrong. Not how you feel. Not how to fix it. Just identify the attachment. Because once you see the attachment, the reaction loses its grip. You don't need their permission to detach. You don't need their permission to stay composed. You don't need their permission to choose silence over impulse. You have a choice. And every time you choose not to react, something changes. Your nervous system calms. Your thinking sharpens. Your presence becomes heavier. People feel it. They may not understand it, but they feel it. Because calm is authority. And authority doesn't react. This chapter is not about becoming passive. It's about becoming precise. Reactive people swing wildly. Controlled people strike deliberately. Big difference. So from this moment forward, you train one habit. When emotion rises, you slow down. When pressure hits, you pause. When someone expects an immediate response, you take your time. Not to punish them, not to manipulate them, but to keep control. Because control is the foundation of everything that follows. Without control, discipline collapses. Without control, confidence is fake. Without control, success is temporary. You have a choice. Reaction is optional. And once you understand that, everything changes. You've now identified the disease. Now it's time to build the cure. You've stopped reacting. Now let's talk about what real power actually is. Chapter 2. Emotional control is real power. Let's get something straight. Power is not aggression. Power is not volume. Power is not dominance displays, threats, or intensity. Real power is emotional control. The ability to stay calm when others are losing themselves. The ability to think clearly when others are flooded. The ability to choose your response instead of being dragged by impulse. That's real power. Everything else is performance. Most people confuse emotion with strength. They think anger means authority. They think passion means conviction. Wrong. Emotion is energy without direction. Control is energy with purpose. That's the key. Look around at any high-stakes environment. Negotiations, leadership, crisis situations, competitive arenas. Who wins? Not the person who reacts fastest. Not the person who feels the most. Not the person who speaks the loudest. The one who stays composed wins. Because composure creates clarity. And clarity creates leverage. You have a choice. You can let your emotions run the moment. Or you can run the moment. But you can't do both. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone can change your emotional state, they temporarily own you. If a comment makes you angry, they've steered you. If silence makes you anxious, they've steered you. If pressure makes you rush, they've steered you. That's not power. That's exposure. And the world exploits exposed people. Not always maliciously. Not always intentionally. But predictability invites pressure. That's why emotional control is not about being cold. It's about being unmovable. You don't need their permission to stay calm. You don't need their permission to slow down. You don't need their permission to think. You have a choice. Most people never exercise it because emotion feels urgent. Urgency is the enemy of intelligence. Emotion says, act now. Control says, observe first. That pause, that space between stimulus and response, is where power lives. And that space can be trained. Start by understanding this. Emotions are chemical events. They rise. They peak. They fall. They do not last forever, unless you feed them with thoughts. Anger needs justification. Fear needs imagination. Anxiety needs stories about the future. If you don't supply the fuel, the fire dies. That's the key. Controlled people don't fight emotion. They starve it. They don't say, I shouldn't feel this. They say, I don't need to act on this. Big difference. One creates internal war. The other creates authority. Think about the people you respect most. The ones whose presence settles a room. The ones who speak slowly and deliberately. The ones who never seem rushed. They're not emotionless. They're regulated. They decide when emotion is useful and when it's expensive. Because emotional expression always has a cost. Sometimes that cost is worth it. Most of the time, it isn't. Reactive people pay without checking the price. Controlled people always check. That's discipline. It's not about suppressing who you are. It's about choosing when to reveal it. That's power. Here's a practical rule. Never make decisions at emotional peaks. Not when you're angry. Not when you're excited. Not when you're afraid. Those are the moments when your judgment is most compromised. Delay is not weakness. Delay is strategy. Say less. Do less. Decide later. You don't need their permission to wait. You have a choice. Now let's talk about pressure. Pressure exposes emotional control faster than anything else. Deadlines. Expectations. Consequences. Most people collapse inward under pressure. They speed up. They panic. They try to force outcomes. Controlled people do the opposite. They slow down. They reduce movement. They reduce speech. They reduce decisions. Because speed amplifies mistakes. Pressure doesn't demand urgency. It demands precision. That's the key. If pressure makes you emotional, you lose leverage. If pressure makes you calm, you gain it. This is why emotional control intimidates people. They don't know where you stand. They don't know how to move you. They don't know what you'll tolerate. Uncertainty shifts power. And emotional restraint creates uncertainty in others. Not by playing games, but by refusing to be predictable. You don't need their permission to be unreadable. You don't need their permission to stay neutral. You don't need their permission to hold your ground silently. You have a choice. Now understand this clearly. Emotional control does not mean inaction. It means intentional action. When you act from control, your words land heavier. Your decisions last longer. Your presence carries weight. Because people can feel when you're not being pushed. This is why controlled people don't chase validation. They don't explain themselves unnecessarily. They don't argue to be understood. They don't perform for approval. They move when they decide to move. And that independence is felt immediately. Emotionally uncontrolled people seek relief. Controlled people seek outcomes. It's not about how you feel. It's about what works. That's discipline. So here's your practice. When emotion rises, don't label it good or bad. Label it temporary. Then ask one question. What response gives me the most leverage right now? Sometimes that response is action. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's walking away. But it's always chosen. You have a choice. And the more often you choose control, the more natural it becomes. Eventually, calm stops being effort. It becomes identity. And identity is stronger than willpower. You are no longer trying to stay composed. You simply are. This chapter gave you the definition of power. Not dominance. Not intensity. Not reaction. Control. But control has enemies. And the biggest one hides in plain sight. Your triggers. Because triggers bypass control entirely. And if you don't identify them, they will own you. You've learned what power is. Now it's time to expose what takes it away. Chapter 3. Your triggers are your weak points. Let's remove the excuses. If something triggers you, it owns you. That's not a judgment. That's a diagnostic. Triggers are not random. They are not bad luck. They are not caused by other people. Triggers are exposed attachments. And every attachment is a weakness until it's controlled. That's the key. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid triggers. They change environments. They change people. They change circumstances. But they never change themselves. So the triggers follow them. Different faces. Same reactions. Because the trigger is not out there. It's in you. You have a choice. You can keep protecting your triggers. Or you can dismantle them. But you cannot do both. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. The things that upset you reveal what you're dependent on. Disrespect triggers you. You're attached to status. Criticism triggers you. You're attached to approval. Being ignored triggers you. You're attached to validation. Uncertainty triggers you. You're attached to control. That's the map. And if you read it honestly, it tells you exactly where your work is. That's the key. Reactive people blame the trigger. Controlled people study it. They don't say, "Why would they do that?" They say, "Why did that move me?" Because the second question creates freedom. The first one creates loops. Here's how triggers actually work. A trigger hits an expectation. That expectation is violated. Emotion spikes. And then, if you're not disciplined, you act. You defend. You explain. You attack. You withdraw. Reaction completed. But here's what most people miss. The emotional spike is automatic. The reaction is optional. You have a choice. Triggers don't force behavior. They invite it. And invitations can be declined. That pause, that moment of awareness, is where power returns. So stop asking how to eliminate triggers. That's weak framing. Start asking how to use them. Because triggers are teachers. Every time something hits you emotionally, it's pointing to a dependency. And dependencies are expensive. They make you predictable. They make you controllable. They make you fragile. The world is not gentle with fragile people. It leans on them. So here's the discipline. When you feel triggered, do not react. Not externally. Not internally. No rehearsed arguments. No mental revenge. No justification loops. You pause. And you ask one question. What am I trying to protect right now? That's it. Not who's wrong. Not what should happen. Not how to fix it. Just identify the attachment. Because once you see it, it weakens. Awareness dissolves unconscious control. That's the key. Let's take criticism. Most people react instantly. They explain. They defend. They counterattack. Why? Because they need to be seen as competent. That need is the trigger. Remove the need, and criticism becomes information. Useful or useless, but not personal. That's control. Or take disrespect. Most people escalate. They raise their voice. They assert dominance. Why? Because they equate respect with identity. Remove that equation, and disrespect loses its teeth. You don't need their permission to stay calm. You don't need their permission to walk away. You don't need their permission to say nothing. You have a choice. Here's a hard truth. If someone can make you emotional on demand, they can steer you anywhere. That's why manipulators look for triggers. They don't fight strength. They poke weaknesses. And most people advertise theirs loudly. Over-explaining. Defensiveness. Emotional volatility. It's all readable. Controlled people are difficult to read because they don't react. They let the moment pass. And moments always pass. That's something reactive people forget. Emotion says, this is urgent. Reality says, this will fade. Time is on the side of the controlled. So instead of fearing triggers, you log them. Literally or mentally. What hit you? Who hit it? What expectation was underneath? Patterns will emerge. And patterns reveal your blind spots. That's not weakness. That's intelligence. It's not about flawlessness. It's about awareness. Here's the shift. Stop saying, they triggered me. Start saying, I discovered something about myself. That language alone restores control. Because now you're not a victim of emotion. You're a student of it. And students improve. You don't need their permission to grow. You don't need their permission to detach. You don't need their permission to change how you respond. You have a choice. Now understand this. Triggers don't disappear overnight. They weaken through repeated non-reaction. Every time you feel the urge and don't act, the neural pathway loses strength. Emotion without action fades faster next time. That's discipline. And discipline compounds. One pause becomes two. Two becomes automatic. Automatic becomes identity. Eventually, the trigger still appears, but it doesn't hook. It knocks, and you don't answer. That's mastery. But there's one behavior that keeps triggers alive longer than anything else. One habit that almost guarantees emotional slavery. And that habit is explaining yourself. Because explanation is driven by insecurity. And insecurity is trigger fuel. If you need people to understand you, agree with you, or validate you, you are exposed. And exposed people react. You've learned how triggers work. You've learned how to identify them. You've learned how to weaken them. Now it's time to remove one of the biggest sources of unnecessary reaction in your life. You mastered your emotional awareness. Now let's talk about the habit that gives your power away daily. Chapter 4. Stop explaining yourself to people who don't care. Let's be blunt. Over-explaining is weakness disguised as communication. It feels polite. It feels reasonable. It feels mature. But most of the time, it's fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being judged. Fear of losing approval. And fear creates reaction. That's the key. You explain yourself when you feel threatened. Not physically, socially. Your status feels uncertain. Your value feels questioned. Your identity feels exposed. So you talk. You justify. You clarify. You add context no one asked for. And in doing that, you give away power. Because explanation is not neutral. Explanation is submission. You are signaling that their opinion matters more than your decision. That's not communication. That's negotiation for approval. You don't need their permission to decide. You don't need their permission to act. You don't need their permission to say no. You have a choice. Here's the hard truth. People who genuinely respect you don't need long explanations. They trust your judgment. They accept your boundaries. They adjust. People who don't respect you use your explanations against you. They poke holes. They argue details. They drag you into debates that never end. Because the goal was never understanding. The goal was control. That's the key. Over-explaining invites resistance. The more reasons you give, the more angles they have to push back. Controlled people understand this. They say less. They state decisions. They move on. Not because they're rude. Because they're clear. Clarity does not require justification. In fact, justification weakens clarity. Look at how you speak when you're unsure. You soften statements. You add qualifiers. You apologize preemptively. I just think that maybe. I could be wrong, but. I'm sorry, I just feel like. That language signals doubt. And doubt invites challenge. That's not about confidence. It's about discipline. You have a choice. You can speak to be accepted. Or you can speak to be understood. But when you try to do both, you lose authority. Here's where most people get stuck. They confuse explanation with honesty. They say, I'm just being transparent. No, you're being reactive. You're responding to perceived judgment that hasn't even been confirmed. You're defending against an imaginary threat. And imaginary threats still cost real energy. That's the key. Silence is not avoidance. Silence is assessment. When you stop explaining, something interesting happens. People reveal themselves. Those who respect you adjust quickly. Those who want control push harder. And now you know exactly who you're dealing with. Information without effort. That's leverage. You don't need their permission to pause. You don't need their permission to withhold details. You don't need their permission to let discomfort exist. You have a choice. Now let's talk about boundaries. Most people think boundaries are something you argue into existence. They're not. Boundaries are enforced by consistency, not explanation. You say what you will do. You say what you won't do. And then you follow through. No speeches. No debates. No emotional justifications. Because boundaries that require explanation are weak boundaries. Strong boundaries are boring. They don't change. They don't escalate. They don't defend themselves. They just exist. And people adapt or remove themselves. Either outcome is fine. That's control. Over-explaining keeps you entangled. It keeps conversations alive that should be dead. It keeps arguments breathing that should have ended. Because every explanation is an invitation to continue. Controlled people close loops. They don't feed unnecessary dialogue. They understand that not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Some misunderstandings are tests. And explaining yourself is how you fail them. That's the key. Here's a simple rule. If someone is committed to misunderstanding you, no explanation will fix it. So stop trying. Your energy is better spent elsewhere. Now notice this. Over-explaining is exhausting. Why? Because it's reactive. You're always responding, always adjusting, always managing perceptions. That's not leadership. That's people-pleasing with better vocabulary. You don't need their permission to disappoint them. You don't need their permission to be disliked. You don't need their permission to be firm. You have a choice. Let's get practical. Next time you feel the urge to explain, pause. Ask yourself one question. Am I explaining to clarify or to be accepted? If it's acceptance, stop talking. Silence will do more work than words ever could. And silence does something powerful. It forces others to sit with their discomfort. Most people talk to relieve their own tension. Controlled people let tension exist. Because tension reveals intentions. That's the key. Now understand this. This is not about becoming cold or uncommunicative. This is about being intentional. When explanation serves strategy, use it. When it serves insecurity, cut it. That distinction alone will transform your presence. You'll speak less. But when you speak, people listen. Because you're no longer filling space. You're occupying it. And people respect space. Over time, something shifts. You stop feeling the need to justify yourself internally. Your identity stabilizes. You know who you are. You know what you stand for. You know why you move the way you move. And when identity is solid, explanation becomes unnecessary. That's discipline. That's control. And control is cumulative. You stopped reacting emotionally. You learned to regulate power. You identified your triggers. Now you've removed one of the biggest leaks. But there's another leak. One that drains control quietly, daily, relentlessly. It comes from what you allow into your mind. Because you can't control yourself if you don't control your inputs. You mastered silence. Now let's talk about what you consume and how it controls you. Chapter 5. Control your inputs or lose your life. Let's be clear. You are not overwhelmed because life is hard. You are overwhelmed because you let too much in. Too many voices. Too many opinions. Too much noise. And noise destroys control. That's the key. Your mind is not designed to handle unlimited input. It is designed to focus, decide, and execute. But most people treat it like an open landfill. News, social media, group chats, complaints, drama disguised as conversation. And then they wonder why they feel scattered. You have a choice. Every input you allow becomes a thought. Every thought becomes a feeling. Every feeling pressures behavior. This is not philosophy. This is mechanics. If you don't control what goes in, you cannot control what comes out. That's discipline. Most people try to control their reactions after the damage is done. Too late. Control starts upstream. It starts with what you expose yourself to. Look at your day. How does it begin? Phone, notifications, messages, noise. Before you've made a single decision for yourself, the world has already decided what you'll think about. That's not living. That's surrender. And surrender feels like stress. That's the key. People say, I don't know why I'm anxious. Yes, you do. Your nervous system has been under constant assault. Endless stimulation tells your brain one thing. Everything is urgent. So your mind never rests. Your body never settles. Your emotions stay reactive. You don't need their permission to disconnect. You don't need their permission to unplug. You don't need their permission to protect your focus. You have a choice. Controlled people are ruthless about inputs. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Ruthless. They understand that attention is a finite resource. And whatever gets attention gets power. If you give your attention to chaos, chaos grows. If you give your attention to progress, progress compounds. That's the key. Now let's talk about information. Most people confuse being informed with being prepared. They are not the same. Information without action creates anxiety. Preparation reduces it. If something enters your mind and does not lead to a decision or action, it is mental clutter. And clutter kills clarity. Controlled people ask one question before consuming anything. Does this help me act better? If the answer is no, it's out. No guilt. No justification. Discipline is not emotional. It's selective. You don't need their permission to be selective. You don't need their permission to ignore trends. You don't need their permission to step away from noise. You have a choice. Now let's talk about people. This is where control really breaks down. You can recover from bad information. Bad environments are harder. Every conversation leaves residue. Some conversations sharpen you. Others drain you. Most people pretend this doesn't matter. It does. If you surround yourself with people who complain, you normalize helplessness. If you surround yourself with people who gossip, you normalize distraction. If you surround yourself with people who fear risk, you inherit their limits. That's not loyalty. That's contamination. And contamination spreads quietly. That's the key. Controlled people limit emotional access. Not because they hate people. Because they respect their own state. They don't attend every argument. They don't absorb every emotion. They don't carry other people's chaos. They choose exposure deliberately. You have a choice. Here's a rule. If a conversation consistently leaves you weaker, shorter, or unfocused, end it. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just reduce frequency. Control does not announce itself. It adjusts silently. Now look at entertainment. What you laugh at trains your values. What you binge trains your expectations. What you normalize trains your behavior. Violence, chaos, dysfunction. Consume it long enough and your nervous system treats it as normal. Then calm feels boring. Silence feels uncomfortable. Focus feels hard. That's conditioning. And conditioning works both ways. So here's the discipline. Protect your mornings. Protect your evenings. Protect the moments when your mind is most open. Those windows decide the tone of your entire day. No news first thing. No drama before sleep. No chaos when you're building momentum. You don't need their permission to structure your day. You don't need their permission to say no to noise. You don't need their permission to live deliberately. You have a choice. Now here's what happens when you do this. Your mind quiets. Your reactions slow. Your decisions sharpen. Not because life got easier. Because you removed friction. Control is subtraction, not addition. You don't add discipline by doing more. You add discipline by allowing less. That's the key. Most people want hacks. This is not a hack. This is hygiene. Mental hygiene. Just like your body reacts to junk food, your mind reacts to junk input. And junk input produces junk decisions. Over time, controlled inputs produce controlled outputs. Calm becomes default. Focus becomes natural. Emotion becomes manageable. You don't feel constantly on edge. Because nothing is constantly invading you. That's control. But inputs alone are not enough. Even with perfect inputs, most people still fail. Why? Because they rely on motivation instead of structure. They wait to feel like acting. They wait to feel ready. They wait for emotion to cooperate. And emotion never cooperates consistently. So the next step is critical. You've controlled your environment. Now you must control your actions, regardless of how you feel. That's where discipline comes in. You've cleaned up what enters your mind. Now let's talk about how you remove emotion from decision-making entirely. Chapter 7. Detach to dominate. Let's correct a misunderstanding. Detachment is not indifference. Detachment is not weakness. Detachment is not giving up. Detachment is control without emotional entanglement. That's the key. Most people lose power because they care in the wrong way. They care about outcomes they can't control. They care about opinions they don't need. They care about timing they can't dictate. And that caring turns into tension. Tension leads to reaction. Reaction leads to mistakes. You have a choice. You can stay attached and reactive, or you can detach and dominate. But you cannot do both. Here's the truth. Attachment creates fear. Fear of loss. Fear of judgment. Fear of failure. Fear speeds you up. Fear narrows your thinking. Fear pulls you into reaction. Detached people are calm because they are not bargaining with outcomes. They do the work. They make the move. They accept the result. No emotional negotiation. That's power. That's the key. Look at any high performer. They care deeply about process. They care lightly about outcome. They focus on what they can control and release what they can't. That's detachment. Not emotional coldness. Strategic distance. You don't need their permission to let go. You don't need their permission to stop gripping. You don't need their permission to move forward regardless. You have a choice. Here's where people get confused. They think attachment equals commitment. It doesn't. Attachment equals dependence. Commitment is disciplined action. Dependence is emotional need. One creates strength. The other creates volatility. That's the key. You can be committed without being attached. In fact, that's the highest form of commitment. You show up. You execute. You adapt. But you don't collapse emotionally if things don't go your way. Because your identity is not tied to the outcome. Identity tied to outcome is fragile. Detach identity, and resilience appears. That's control. Now let's talk about relationships. This is where attachment destroys people fastest. Needing approval. Needing reassurance. Needing constant feedback. That need creates behavior. Over-texting. Over-explaining. Overreacting to small changes. And that behavior repels respect. Detached people do not chase stability. They are stability. They don't demand consistency from others. They bring it themselves. That's dominance. You don't need their permission to stop chasing. You don't need their permission to pull back emotionally. You don't need their permission to observe instead of react. You have a choice. Now here's a critical shift. Detach from results, not standards. Your standards stay high. Your execution stays sharp. But your emotional state does not depend on immediate success. Why? Because success is delayed. And emotional volatility during delay ruins consistency. That's the key. Detached people understand time. They don't rush outcomes. They don't force results. They don't panic during silence. They know momentum is invisible before it's obvious. So they stay calm. Calm allows patience. Patience allows precision. Precision allows domination. This is why detachment makes you dangerous. You don't flinch. You don't chase. You don't beg. And people feel that. They can't rush you. They can't pressure you. They can't emotionally hijack you. Because you are not attached. Now let's get practical. When you feel anxious about an outcome, ask, what part of this is actually under my control? Then focus exclusively on that. Release the rest. Not emotionally. Strategically. That release frees mental bandwidth. Bandwidth creates clarity. Clarity creates better decisions. That's control. You have a choice. Here's another rule. Care about execution. Detach from validation. Validation is external. Execution is internal. One you can control. One you cannot. Detached people don't wait for praise to continue. They don't stop because no one noticed. They move because movement is who they are. Identity over emotion. That's the key. Now notice this. When you detach, people often lean in, because detachment creates space, and space creates curiosity, not manipulation. Presence. People respect what doesn't need them. This applies everywhere. Work, relationships, conflict. The less you emotionally cling, the more leverage you gain. Because leverage comes from independence. And independence requires detachment. Now understand this. Detachment does not mean you don't feel. It means feelings don't steer. You acknowledge emotion. You don't obey it. That's mastery. Most people feel emotion and move. Controlled people feel emotion and pause. That pause is everything. You have a choice. Over time, detachment becomes natural. You stop personalizing delays. You stop internalizing silence. You stop reacting to noise. Your nervous system stabilizes. And when your nervous system is stable, you see clearly. And when you see clearly, you act decisively. That's domination. But detachment alone is not enough. Because even detached people can lose leverage if they talk too much. Words can give away position faster than emotion. Silence protects leverage. And silence, when used correctly, is a weapon. You've learned how to release emotional grip. Now it's time to learn how to hold power without saying a word. Chapter 8. Silence is a weapon. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. That's why it works. Silence creates tension. Tension creates mistakes. Mistakes reveal leverage. That's the key. People talk to relieve discomfort. They talk to fill space. They talk to regain control. Controlled people let silence do the work. Because silence shifts pressure outward. You have a choice. You can speak to feel better. Or you can stay silent to gain leverage. Only one is strategic. Silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is intentional non-disclosure. You don't reveal your thoughts. You don't rush to clarify. You don't correct immediately. You wait. And while you wait, others show you their hand. That's power. Look at arguments. Most arguments only continue because both sides keep talking. Someone has to feed the fire. Silence starves it. When you stop responding emotionally, the dynamic collapses. Because reaction needs participation. No participation. No escalation. That's control. You don't need their permission to stop engaging. You don't need their permission to pause. You don't need their permission to let silence exist. You have a choice. Now let's talk about negotiations. The first person to break silence usually loses. Why? Because they reveal urgency. Urgency weakens position. Silence signals patience. Patience signals strength. And strength attracts concessions. That's the key. Controlled people don't rush to fill gaps. They let others explain. They let others justify. They let others overshare. Every extra word is information. Information creates advantage. Now here's where people misuse silence. They use it emotionally. They go silent to punish. They go silent to manipulate. They go silent to avoid. That's not power. That's insecurity wearing strategy. Real silence is neutral. No tension in the body. No story in the mind. No emotional charge. Just stillness. Stillness makes people project. They fill the gap with assumptions. And assumptions are rarely accurate. That's leverage. You have a choice. Silence also protects you from self-sabotage. Most mistakes are verbal. Over-explaining. Over-committing. Over-promising. Silence prevents premature exposure. You don't show your hand before the moment demands it. Controlled people speak when speech improves position. Otherwise, they wait. That's discipline. Let's talk about leadership. Leaders who talk constantly lose weight. Their words blur together. Leaders who speak selectively command attention. Because silence gives words contrast. Contrast creates impact. If everything is loud, nothing is heard. Silence sets the stage. You don't need their permission to speak less. You don't need their permission to pause before responding. You don't need their permission to think. You have a choice. Now notice something important. Silence makes insecure people nervous. They interpret it as judgment. They interpret it as rejection. They interpret it as threat. That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is control. If silence reveals someone's insecurity, that's information. And information is useful. This is why silence exposes intentions. People reveal themselves when they're uncomfortable. They explain too much. They escalate. They backtrack. Controlled people observe. They don't interrupt the reveal. That's the key. Silence also trains your nervous system. When you don't rush to respond, your body learns safety. Your heart rate stays lower. Your breathing slows. Your mind clears. Over time, silence becomes comfortable. And comfort with silence is dominance. Because you are no longer driven by discomfort. Most people talk to escape tension. Controlled people tolerate tension. Tolerance creates authority. Now let's get tactical. Next time you're challenged verbally, do this. Pause. Breathe. Say nothing. Let the moment hang. Watch what happens. 9 times out of 10, the other person keeps talking. They clarify. They soften. They reveal. And you gain ground without effort. You don't need their permission to wait. You don't need their permission to let them speak. You don't need their permission to say nothing. You have a choice. Now here's an important warning. Silence is powerful only when your internal state is calm. If you're silent but emotionally reactive inside, you're still leaking energy. That's why previous chapters matter. Silence works because you're not attached. Because you're disciplined. Because you're controlled. Otherwise, silence turns into resentment. And resentment eventually explodes. This is silence with control. Not silence as avoidance. Big difference. When silence is aligned with clarity, it sharpens presence. People lean in. They listen. They wait. Because you're not begging for attention. You're holding it. That's power. Now here's the deeper layer. Silence creates space for identity to form. When you stop reacting verbally, you stop reinforcing old patterns. You stop being the person who always explains, always defends, always responds. A new identity emerges. One that observes. One that chooses. One that moves deliberately. Identity shapes behavior automatically. And that's the goal. You've learned how to use silence externally. Now it's time to lock this control internally. Because true mastery is not something you do. It's something you are. You've mastered restraint. You've mastered detachment. You've mastered silence. Now let's make it permanent. Chapter 9. Build an identity that doesn't react. At some point, control stops being something you practice. It becomes something you are. That's the shift. Until now, you've been managing behavior. Pausing. Slowing down. Choosing deliberately. That works, but it costs effort. Identity removes effort. Because identity decides automatically. That's the key. Most people live with an identity that reacts. I'm emotional. I'm intense. That's just how I am. Those aren't traits. They're habits you repeated long enough to believe. And beliefs drive behavior faster than discipline ever will. You have a choice. You can keep managing reactions. Or you can become someone who doesn't react. Only one scales. Identity answers one question instantly. What do people like me do in moments like this? If your identity is reactive, the answer is obvious. If your identity is controlled, the answer is different. And automatic. That's power. Here's the truth. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your identity. That's why people relapse under pressure. They haven't changed who they are, only what they try to do. Under stress, identity takes over. So we change identity. Not with affirmations. Not with pretending. With evidence. Identity is built by repeated proof. Every time you pause instead of reacting, you cast a vote. Every time you stay silent instead of explaining, you cast a vote. Every time you detach instead of clinging, you cast a vote. Votes accumulate. Eventually, the identity locks in. That's the key. So stop saying, "I'm trying not to react." Start saying, "I don't react." Language matters. Not to convince others. To program yourself. You don't need their permission to redefine yourself. You don't need their permission to change your standards. You don't need their permission to become unmovable. You have a choice. Now understand this. Identity is not who you think you are when things are easy. Identity is who shows up under pressure. That's the real test. So you train under pressure. You don't wait for calm environments. You use stress as rehearsal. When something triggers you, you don't say, "This is bad." You say, "This is practice." That reframes everything. Triggers become representatives. Pressure becomes training. Silence becomes strength. That's the key. Controlled identity has rules. Not vague values, rules. Rules remove negotiation. For example, I don't respond immediately when emotional. I don't explain myself unnecessarily. I don't make decisions under pressure. I observe before acting. These are identity rules. You don't debate them. You follow them. Because this is who you are now. You have a choice. Now notice what happens when identity shifts. You stop monitoring yourself constantly. There's less internal dialogue. Less self-correction. Less effort. Because reaction is no longer an option you consider. It's not suppressed. It's obsolete. That's mastery. People will notice before you do. They'll say things like, "You're different. You're calmer." You don't get pulled into things anymore. That's identity becoming visible. And with visibility comes influence. People trust what's stable. They follow what's consistent. They respect what doesn't bend emotionally. That's power. Now here's a warning. When you change identity, your environment may resist. People who benefited from your reactions will push harder. They'll test boundaries. They'll provoke. They'll escalate. That's confirmation, not failure. It means the old pattern is dying. Stay consistent. Identity solidifies through resistance. That's the key. You don't argue your new identity. You demonstrate it. Silently. Repeatedly. Without explanation. Let actions teach. Now let's talk about internal identity. This is where most people still leak control. They stop reacting outwardly, but react internally. They rehearse arguments. They replay conversations. They fantasize about responses. That's still reaction. Controlled identity applies internally first. You don't argue with thoughts. You notice them and return to focus. Thoughts are weather. Identity is climate. Weather changes. Climate remains. You don't need their permission to stop mental noise. You don't need their permission to redirect focus. You don't need their permission to be mentally quiet. You have a choice. Here's a powerful identity statement. I observe. I decide. Repeat it. Not emotionally. Practically. When something happens, you observe. Then you decide. Not instantly. Not emotionally. Deliberately. That phrase becomes automatic. And automation is freedom. Now understand this. Identity is reinforced by environment. So protect it. Limit exposure to people who mock discipline. Reduce time in chaotic spaces. Avoid inputs that reward reaction. This isn't isolation. It's preservation. You don't plant a seed in a storm. You stabilize first. Then you expand. That's discipline. Now here's the payoff. When identity is controlled, life simplifies. You don't second-guess constantly. You don't replay every interaction. You don't chase closure. You act. And move on. Momentum replaces anxiety. Clarity replaces noise. And calm becomes your baseline. That's control. You've done the work. You stopped reacting. You learned emotional control. You dismantled triggers. You stopped explaining. You controlled inputs. You pre-decided discipline. You detached. You mastered silence. Now you've built the identity. There's only one thing left. Decision. Because nothing changes until you decide. Finally, fully, permanently. This is where everything locks in. Chapter 10. Nothing changes until you decide it does. Everything you've heard up to this point means nothing without one thing. Decision. Not interest. Not agreement. Not understanding. Decision. Most people never change, not because they don't know what to do, but because they never decide who they are going to be. They flirt with discipline. They visit control. They rehearse change. But they never move in. That's the key. Change does not happen gradually at first. It happens instantly, the moment you decide. Behavior adjusts later. Comfort follows later. Results appear later. But identity changes in a moment. You have a choice. Right now, most people are waiting for certainty. They want proof before commitment. They want confidence before action. They want comfort before discipline. That order is backwards. You decide first. You act second. Confidence comes last. That's control. Here's the truth. Your life is the result of thousands of tiny non-decisions. Moments where you could have paused, but didn't. Moments where you could have stayed silent, but reacted. Moments where you could have walked away, but explained. Those moments compound, and they create identity. Today, you interrupt that pattern. Not by trying harder, by deciding differently. That's the key. Decision is not emotional. Decision is final. No bargaining. No, I'll try. No, starting Monday. Decided people don't negotiate with themselves. They move. You don't need their permission to decide. You don't need their permission to change. You don't need their permission to stop being reactive. You have a choice. Now understand this. Decision creates friction. Your old habits will resist. Your environment will test you. People will poke your old buttons. That's normal. That's confirmation. Because resistance only appears when change is real. If nothing pushes back, nothing changed. So expect it. Welcome it. Resistance is proof you've stepped out of your old identity. That's the key. From this point forward, your standard is simple. You do not react. Not because it's easy. Not because it feels good. Because it's who you are now. You pause. You breathe. You decide. Every time. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You don't need to attend every emotional invitation. You choose where your energy goes. That's control. Let's collapse the entire book into one rule. Reaction is optional. Not sometimes. Not eventually. Always. You may feel emotion. You may feel pressure. You may feel the urge. But you do not act without choice. That single rule changes everything. It changes how people treat you. It changes how you see yourself. It changes what you tolerate and what you walk away from. Now here's the moment most people fail. They agree, but don't commit. They say, this makes sense. Then they go back to reacting. Understanding without decision is entertainment. Decision without action is fantasy. You do neither. You decide, and you act. Immediately. That's the key. So here is your challenge. For the next 24 hours, you react to nothing. Nothing. No emotional responses. No rushed replies. No explanations. No defensive energy. You observe everything. You let moments pass. You let people reveal themselves. You let pressure exist without obeying it. And you decide deliberately. One day. That's it. And here's what will happen. Your nervous system will calm. Your mind will slow. Your presence will sharpen. You'll feel space where there used to be urgency. That space is control. Once you feel it, you'll never want to give it back. That's why this works. Control is addictive, in the best way. Now understand this clearly. You are not becoming someone new. You are removing what never belonged to you. The reactivity, the noise, the emotional chaos. What remains is clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Because clear people can't be manipulated. Clear people don't rush. Clear people don't beg. Clear people decide. And decided people win. Quietly, consistently, inevitably. This is not motivation. This is instruction. From this moment forward, when something happens, you ask, do I need to react, or do I need to decide? And you choose decision. Every time. That's discipline. That's power. That's control. You've reached the end of this audiobook. But if you've been listening correctly, this is where everything begins. Stop reacting. Start controlling everything. Now.